going to call to order a joint meeting of the Los Angeles City Council's Homelessness and Poverty Committees and Housing Committee. My name is Marquise Harris Dawson. I'm the chair of the Homelessness and Poverty Committee. We're joined by our chairman of the Housing Committee, the esteemed Senator Gil Cedillo. I will introduce the members of the Homelessness and Poverty Committee, and I'll ask the chairman to introduce the members of the Housing Committee. We're joined by our vice chair, and we want to give her a rousing welcome to her first committee meeting. The vice chair of the Homelessness and Poverty Committee, our newest member to the Los Angeles City Council, District 7 Representative Monica Rodriguez. We're also joined by H&P members, council members Jose Huizar, Kern Price, Mike Bonin, and didn't I lose somebody? Huh? That's it. All right. Chairman Cedillo.
Thank you, sir. You also wear two hats. You're a member of the Housing Committee, which makes sense because there's an important intersection that's taking place in our city as we grow out of this crisis, and that's for us to build affordability and special needs housing. And so it just makes sense that you and I share participation in both committees. So kudos to whoever came up with that. And then, of course, money is key to this, and so we're happy in our committee to be joined by Paul Krikorian, who understands that we have to get the best value out of each dollar, is committed to our mission, our shared goals, and is maybe perhaps more deeply committed because he's vigilant over the dollars and makes sure that we have the money to do the things that we do. We don't have a penny to waste.
That's right.
And we've got to do this as efficiently and as effectively as we can, making sure everybody gets paid a fair salary for a fair day's work, and making sure that we have the quality of housing projects. I've given this speech in Sacramento before. If there's anybody who deserves good quality housing, and that comes from people who know how to do the job, it's the poor people of this city and this state. So.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Cedillo. So we'll begin our meeting with public comment cards for people who submitted cards on both items. You'll have 2 minutes to speak, and that'll exhaust your time for this meeting. I'll call you up now, and you can come to the desk and speak in turn. One person is named Herman, and another person is named Yvonne Michelle Autry. 2 minutes each. You have 2 minutes total.
So you see, normally you get 3 minutes, but it shows you how fucked up this housing proposition HHH is under the loan program. But let's not forget that independent living sued the dumb bastards of the city of Los Angeles because under ADA compliance, they violated the disability rights of individuals who couldn't use the housing as a place to call home. Isn't that fucked up? And then you have the situation of our now President Trump gonna sue the fuck out of housing. It's called the Housing Act, for the record, because once again, abuse, waste, and fraud of government money at local and federal dollars, bamboozled by morons who can't put a budget under HHH. And as the chair of this committee put it, we need the money, and we need more money to resolve all the housing issues. Well, they're not going to get resolved because we have a punk bullshit councilman by the name of Jose Huizar who used gentrification to push all of us out of our community so that the white nigger Jews can move in and live in a beautiful, nice built home by all us hardworking people in Los Angeles. But I don't go for that bullshit. And in regards to your so-called amendments to the Proposition HH report dated for May 16, 2015, it's irrelevant. You should sit here today and give us an answer. Build, build, build. Start off with all those metro lots that are empty and been there ever since the CRLA fucked up all our communities and their poor investments in our development in the city of Los Angeles, and now we have to pay more rent and you can't live in your fucking car. Fuck all of you.
Ms. Autry.
Okay, thank you, Herman. Well, what I'd like to say is that, first of all, in exposing the fact that during this regentrification process, I'm hoping that you will take that money and use it to house the people who are the most indigent, so that this is recorded and you are liable, so that why should we have to continually urge you when this is quite obviously banishment and removal under the auspices of using the HHH or that monies to serve the community. Homelessness is an industry. So quite obviously, during this regentrification process, it's now become more lucrative for the city, of course, to regentrify and to redevelop Skid Row. Well, our community is your money. This is my community. This is my neighborhood. I want the money to be used for women, and I hope that the money will be used, again, to adequately address the issues of homelessness, the fact that these people need jobs, they need training. They do not need to be marginalized. They do not need to be experimented on. We should not be targeted as people to be put in the trash. We should not be shocked, and we should not be used as training purposes or science projects for those who are in maintenance of a population or depopulation program or that agenda. I'd also like to speak on behalf of specifically those of us who are housed or who have housing and are still labeled and character assassinated, stigmatized, surveilled, and tortured because of that status. So I'm speaking against the incrimination of homelessness, the demonization of homelessness in this class system. The fact that many of the Jewish landowners are now coercing us to leave so they can
Thank you so
raise
much.
our rent to market
That's your
rate.
time.
On the record, I'm in objection to that. This is still downtown Los Angeles. It is a democracy.
All right.
It's not a plutocracy.
You're now disrupting the
By the
meeting.
people.
We'll ask you not to disrupt the meeting again,
The well.
or you have to find your way to another part of the building. Mr. Clerk, can you begin our meeting with the agenda items as listed?
Yes, sir. And just a reminder, Mr. Chair, we have two more general public comment cards. We have two.
Yes,
Okay.
but these are only one, so.
Okay, yes.
Thank you for that
Thanks,
reminder.
sir. Item number one is a COCLA and LA Housing Community Investment Department joint report relative to the Proposition HHH Permanent Supportive Housing Loan Program and Facilities Program for fiscal year 2017-2018.
Excellent. So this item is to discuss how we will go forward with our HHH projects, and we have representatives here from the CAO, CLA, and HSID to make a report. I will note for the record, Mr. Clerk, there are no public comment cards on agenda item number one, unless you're holding on to some.
None,
You're
sir.
not. So public comment is closed on this matter, and we'll hear from staff. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Yolanda Chavez with the CAO's office. I'm joined today by Ed Gibson with the Housing and Community Investment Department, Meg Barclay, the City Homeless Coordinator, and Ivanez Barbaro with the CLA. The report before you today outlines amendments to the report dated May 16th and that you considered on June 7th, which is related to Proposition HHH. First, the Permanent Supportive Housing Loan Program application guidelines for fiscal year 17-18, and the RFP for the Facilities Program for this fiscal year for the bond issuance for fiscal year 18-19. At the June 7th meeting of these committees, you requested that we report back on how we can incent geographic distribution of both housing and facilities throughout the city. You also requested that we conduct additional stakeholder outreach so that it can inform both the housing and facilities application guidelines. We believe this report responds to both of those issues. I will first turn over the presentation to Ed Gibson, who will outline the recommendations for the housing program, and then Meg Barclay will outline the recommendations for the facilities program.
Good afternoon, Ed Gibson, Housing Community Investment Department. At our last joint meeting, there was a great discussion about geographic distribution and a request to how we could further incentivize that. We had quite a conversation with some of the challenges associated with that, and I'll just go over that real quickly, is how do you incentivize areas which have been difficult to develop without de-incentivizing other areas, which is what's not allowed. And so we've gone around and around in several different discussions, but what we've looked at a great number of factors around the way, and it's actually a very technical and tricky issue. So what we have proposed here is an interim measure while additional data, which will be here shortly, comes forth, and then we'll hire a consultant to give us a better look at what it is. So inside the report, we are recommending using the small difficult to develop areas which is established by HUD. So it's areas basically areas that are basically high opportunity areas, difficult to develop, established by HUD. So it's a range that you're allowed to provide additional incentives inside those types of areas. So it helps spread that geographic distribution, if you will, since those are harder. They're higher opportunity areas, better schools. There's a long formula that they go forth and to develop those. And they're tied back to tax credits and affordable housing specifically. With that, we're proposing to increase the developer fee. So currently, developer fee on the 4% transactions is capped at $2.5 million. CIDLAC and the state allow you to go above that up to 15% of your costs, but it has to be deferred, so no one will pay additional cash over the top. So in those difficult to develop areas, we're going to use, in the interim measure, allowing them to collect that full 15%. So anything over the $2.5 million will be considered deferred developer fee, which is technically paid for other soft lenders' debt. But what that comes to is it'll also allow them to increase the number of tax credits available for the deal, thus giving them also more financial resources for the program, for their project. In addition, SDDAs, as I'm going to call them, small difficult develop areas, you're also able to get a boost in those areas with tax credits as well. So the recommendation at this moment in time is to allow that increased developer fee. They'll be able to leverage that fee to increase the amount of tax credits and get the boost. And we'll see if that begins to make a difference in those difficult to develop areas. While that's going on for the first rounds of HHH, which is this first fiscal year, we're waiting on the housing assessment, which is underway for the city right now, which also has to address opportunities in housing in the areas where we need them and what are the needs in this housing assessment. So how do we get more housing in certain areas where it's been difficult to develop? And we'll use that information along with a consultant to try to better structure an incentive program, because it has to be an incentive program to help further development in those difficult areas. I'm going to say the more challenging, for us at times the more expensive areas, and tie those two things together. There's a lot of fair housing issues inside of here, I apologize, that you bump into. So it's key for us for that housing assessment to come out, to take a look at that and what those recommendations are, because we're going to have to tie the city's housing incentives to that anyway. So might as well take care of that one shot. They're in the midst of that right now, so our intention is when that report comes out, we will use that report to help inform us on what they found inside their study about what else needs to be addressed. And when we come to do the regs, which we'll hopefully have done sometime next March for everybody for the next coming fiscal year, that we will have analyzed, discussed amongst many parties, what is the best path forward for this challenging issue. What we know is just throwing money at an issue doesn't do it. And how you divide that money becomes a challenge. And every time you just throw money at issue, it seems things just get more expensive to match it. So making sure we have some control features that are logical, that are actually providing the incentive here is going to be the key in making sure that they stay within fair housing law requirements on how we're providing those incentives in those areas. The other feature inside the report was a request to keep the $80,000 per unit subsidy through the entire fiscal year. So at this moment, it was recommended just for October, and it's saying do October and February. So it's just one full regulation cycle instead of breaking it apart. That subsidy was put inside of there because there are no other funding sources that are actually able to assist right now. The hope was No Place Like Home from the state level, which will come to our county, would be up and running, but this year or early 2018, and it is expected now to be late 2018 by the time they really get it going, and that's probably most likely, I'm going to say 2019. And if we wait for that to match up with all the subsidy instead of limiting it, we won't see any housing for quite a while. So the recommendation is just carry it one more round. We'll incentivize a few more projects, hopefully speed them up, get them in the pipeline. We'll tie it to the developer fee discussion we just had, and let's see if we could actually make something happen in some areas inside the city. Our intention right now is we'll wait for that housing assessment, engage the consultant, so there's a request for a consultant inside the report, start about the strategizing, reviewing that report as it comes out. And we're not going to wait till actually officially, but there'll be public comments on a lot of things along the way for that housing assessment. Incorporate that, and then we will, upon approval of what we have proposed in front of you, we will release draft regulations. Those draft regulations will go out to the developer community talking about what's in the term sheet, what we're proposing. We will obtain their comments, as we do. We release regs every year. We obtain their comments. We incorporate those comments. We go back and forth on what the issues are, what works best. A lot of times, these deals are very complicated, and at times unintended consequences come up from the minor things, not necessarily the big things, or both. And so we always do a public comment period with regulations, and we're proposing it for these as well. So as soon as we have approval from council and the mayor, we will release those and start down a timeline. Our goal is to release our regulations in October, about mid-October, given the current date, and open up for that first round and close in mid-November and start reviewing the applications we have. We did a Survey Monkey just to see what was out there real quick. We had 21 respondents. The average subsidy request was $9.6 million. Seems to be quite a bit of interest. There were a few who were asking for well above, but there were 3 who asked, of the 21 asked that way above that number of $12 million, but the rest were all underneath. And so it was a good response to see of the interest out there, and a good number of them were showing shorter timelines if they could use this HH money to get going with the parameters as they're outlined in this report. And with that, I will answer any questions. Turn it to Meg. Very good.
Good afternoon, Meg Barclay, City Homeless Coordinator in the Office of the CAO. As requested by the committees in June, the CAO conducted outreach to homeless service providers, expedited RFP respondents, and other stakeholders to solicit feedback on the proposed policy changes that were in the report dated May 16th. The outreach effort and the results are summarized in the report itself, beginning on page 6 and in attachment 3 to the report. Recommended changes to these policies are underlined in the report, so that we wanted to provide the original proposals and also the changes so you could see how they changed. And those changes are resulting from the outreach and also the feedback we received from your committees in June. Most notably, we're recommending that the leverage requirement we could allow a leverage requirement to be met not only with cash, but also with equity in a proposer-owned project or with the value of a long-term lease, and we'll provide guidance for how to calculate that. The letter of good standing from a major service funder rather than just limiting that to LAHSA, and we've also clarified that the letter could come from the board of directors if a proposer doesn't receive public funding in support of services. The CAO will also provide links, and we're working on some basic instructions for some data that we know about, and also just ways to access that data for meeting the bonus point requirement on the geographic distribution, just understanding sometimes that's difficult to do. We would have, based on the recommendations of the Department of Public Works Bureau of Engineering, we are recommending a budget contingency for new construction and for rehabilitation of projects of 10% for new construction, 15% for rehabilitation projects. And that's basically just to make sure that if there are cost overruns, there's a cushion in there to establish those, since we only issue bonds and collect the money on the issuance once a year. The RFP will also notify applicants that a project labor agreement is being considered by the City Council and may apply to their projects if the project's identified through this RFP. And we are also we want to include a requirement that proposers either participate in the coordinated entry system or describe their connection to coordinated entry system participants. And that's really to make sure that the services that are being provided in the facilities that are funded with Proposition HHH are connected to all the other services that are available to homeless populations. So the eligibility requirements from the May 16th report have also been updated to reflect these changes, and they're also included in this report as well. We also wanted to note that the RFP will stress that the program allows proposers to partner and submit joint applications. And that really should help organizations with limited experience to meet the capacity requirements, and also may encourage more creative proposals. The report also provides a revised RFP implementation calendar and the process for city-funded facilities. That process hasn't changed from the original proposal. And so we request approval of these proposed recommendations as amended and the authority to release the RFP for the 2017-18 Prop HHH Facilities Program for the 18-19 bond issuance.
With that, we'll entertain your questions.
Excellent. Mr. Huizar?
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for working on this. And this is where the rubber meets the road. And the voters have certainly set a direction for us to move forward and provide more housing for our homeless. Key to this is that we decentralize services, and that is something that's in our strategic plan that we adopted, our comprehensive strategic plan on homelessness, the first ever of its kind in the city. And in our guidelines there, we put very clearly that we want to decentralize services. It's not good for the individuals themselves. It's not good for the neighborhood. And what I like about your guidelines is that, in fact, you're giving priority to areas where there's a scarcity of services. I know there will be some challenges with that. Historically, we have been concentrating services in particular parts of the city, and we want to be able to move in that direction. So that, I think we're moving in a very good direction. I understand that the fair housing assessment has not been completed by HUD. That will be coming up for the next round of guidelines. We're going to use that. You mentioned we will use those as our guidelines, right, for that
We'll
time.
use that information contained in that report to help us make informed decisions about, it tells us what the need is, so we have to come up with a strategy of how to address
Gotcha.
that.
And
Gives
so
us
for the
help.
for the interim and for this coming year, we're using our own internal analysis. Is that correct? Or what are we using now?
We're going to use the small, difficult to develop areas by HUD and use the developer fee incentive tied with the basis boost that comes from 9% tax credits by them developing in those areas. And hopefully that will provide some incentive in those outlying areas, because that
Okay.
is a path we can do right now.
So looking at those maps, there's a portion of Skid Row in downtown that's included. I don't understand how those could be included as one of the areas that need to be high priority areas, given that there's already services nearby. Do you know how that came about?
It's HUD's calculations of what is a small to difficult to develop area, and it includes things such as income, wage differential, sometimes education, but it's based off on the American Community Survey, some of the old census data, so it is their particular formula. So we don't get a say in how they do it. They just
Got you.
designate it, and it changes each year.
But for our purposes, if we know what the area looks like, if we know what it is, and if we all go take a walk down there and we know what our data shows us, and we know that doesn't apply to what we're trying to accomplish here, can we change that for our own internal guidelines for the coming year?
No, we cannot.
Why not?
So either we use their assessment or we don't. That's the choice. You can't carve up by saying we're not going to do it somewhere that's designated like that.
Okay.
So I think that part of the challenge, Councilman, is that we have to find a legal way to increase the subsidy for units or provide some kind of boost to the subsidy to the more expensive areas of the city. But we have to do it in a legal manner. And so this, at least for this first year, in terms of using HUD's determination of small, difficult to develop areas, justifies the fact that, at least for this first year, HSID would increase the developer fee, and then at the same time, because HSID is doing that, tax credits will increase the subsidy to projects in those areas by 30%. So that really will make the project pencil in those areas. But unless we do it in a legal manner, then we would be in violation of fair housing, because we can't treat different parts of the cities differently unless we can justify it legally.
Got it. There's got to be some consistent rules.
Right.
And this is for 1 year. We've looked at what we see anticipated to come forward as projects. There's one project coming forward in the next year, so we will take a look at that time and see if it fits the criteria and everything else. So I understand that. Okay, thank you. My other question is, why have we set a minimum project size of 25 units?
Economies of scale, tax credits, leveraging, Section 8 vouchers. So, basically Section 8 is looking at 25 units or larger if you're going to go after Section 8 vouchers in the most case. Tax credits, you're really going to need to be at least a 35-unit project or larger. Otherwise, you're going to end up combining projects just to leverage the tax credits along the way. So there's scale that comes to be in order to get these financing sources that we're looking to leverage. And so when you drop below 25 unit size project, they're not eligible. Those sources don't align anymore. And so
what did we come up?
We'll need to do if we're going to go that route, which I'm happy to have that conversation. Honestly, I've mentioned this several times before. Is this got to be a special type of program, because it's not going to be the model that we see today. It's going to have to be something really custom and special.
Two scenarios. What if we want to convert some motel that's less than 25 or some innovative project that's very cost effective for us? Are we going to skip on those just because they're under 25? And or what if we want to add to some market rate project and they might want to use HHH? Will we lose out on those opportunities? And most of these are less than 25 units when we add it to market rate projects.
Getting it to work in a market rate project is another story, which you show me one that works. I'm happy to take a look at it. Inside the guidelines, we put in that term sheet and out, if there's some innovative ideas or something else like that, we want to look at it. Make no mistake, we want to look at it.
Let's take that line of thinking. Why have a cap at all then? Let's just not have a cap and then say if it's a great project and it's innovative, we'll look at it. But why set an arbitrary line for something that we're looking may or may not work in the larger picture of how development occurs?
For practicality, for economies of scale, for staffing, for processing, we want more units, we want them on the street, and we want them faster. And so what you're proposing has great validity and merit. They're a slower timeline with no other leverage sources. And when you look at the financing stacks and what it's going to take to get there, nothing lines up appropriately for them. So a small deal takes as long, if not longer, as a mid-sized to large deal. Yeah. And just looking at how you're going to focus your efforts and getting the most that we can with the resources we have. We've tried to create a program that'll grab about 80% of everything that we can see out there, recognizing there's another 20% on the fringes. And some of those on the fringes are, if they're really large deals, they're actually going to break in two, because that's what the financing requirements are going to make them do anyway. So then they become two HH deals in one structure, if you will, if that's the way they're going. And then now you're back to the financing. Okay, that's two. Now that's $24 million. And then you're having to make sure you don't over-subsidize something again.
So if the trade-off is staffing and resources and administrative costs versus we may not see some innovative projects out there, I'll take the innovative projects and beef up on staffing or whatever we have to do, because there might be some great projects. And it seems like there's a lot of discussion these days about getting those smaller projects and motel conversions, et cetera, that are going to be looking for some funding like HHH.
The motel conversions are actually I'm part of the motel conversion conversation. entirely. Most of those motel conversions are talking about a master lease with the county. Most don't align with HHH because the owners aren't looking to sell the properties. In the instance where they are, we align already. We do. So I fully expect to see HHH motel conversion projects.
Okay.
I fully expect to see that. That's one of the things that's been queued up in the radar, and it has not, the 25 has not been a problem. And in fact, it is expected that those will actually go as 4% tax credit deals. Some tried to go, I'm sorry to get off, some tried to go another route, but the financing didn't work and it couldn't come together. And that's fine. And long lessons learned. So we will, I saw that happen, and we remember and we learn
Thank you.
from what others have issues with.
So I think
Thank you.
just another point, and actually I would suggest to HSID, because I think it's important for you to kind of see the results, is that when developers are trying to find supportive housing, part of the equation is the service component. And so that's also an issue as to how many units, where's this, service space provided within the project? Does the project have that type of space for services, especially if the population is chronically homeless, right? That's another issue. But I would suggest to HSID that they may want to remove the minimum to see what they get in this in this next year, and see what comes in, and then they could assess whether it's worth seeing. I know it's like it would create lots of work for Ed, but I think it would be interesting to see what kind of, if we get those types of innovative projects that may still work, and where developers can finance it, because what you'll see is the developers, this is very hard development, and developers who do this are clear as to what they need to do in terms of the housing part, the service component to make the projects work. But I would suggest that if we wanted to test it, it may be a good time to test it in this next.
And I agree with you. I think I'd rather not have a minimum so that at least we get to see everything. And with our own internal guidelines, if they're less than 25 and they're not working out for the space needs, for the services or whatever it is. But we may be blocking off some projects that we never see if in fact we have this minimum. So that's something to ponder. It's only a year for us to see if in fact it works or it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just to add a little bit of the COC, which is the Citizens Oversight Committee for HHH, has also been looking into innovative projects. They've been listening from different types of communities and projects, and how we can better incentivize and fund some of these innovative projects. So I think we're all aligned that that needs to happen. So those conversations are happening there as well, and maybe recommendations will be forwarded to the council.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ms. Rodriguez.
I was just curious if there's been any consideration to any possible project collaboration with HACLA on existing affordable housing sites where we have public housing, to see where we might be able to, dovetail our resources together to help redevelop and incorporate some of the objectives that we have with HHH.
Well, we've been working with HACLA for a good number of years, predating my actual arrival to the Housing Community Investment Department. So currently, in order to do permanent supportive housing, we must have an operating subsidy. And since there's only two sources currently, one is Section 8 vouchers that become project-based, which means we work with HACLA, or the developer specifically work with HACLA. And then the other one is the flexible housing subsidy that's coming from the county for those who are high utilizers of the healthcare system. So we have worked with HACLA for quite a while. For a moment there was a joint application system with them as well, but as we move to a more of a pipeline to better manage what was out there, they have to put in their vouchers to what's ready at the time or what's becoming ready. So we've worked with HACLA a great deal. As we beef up the line and trying to increase production, we are working with HACLA and the county with the flexible housing subsidy along the way. So most of those vouchers that you see are from the Housing Authority, are in the department's affordable housing portfolio. That is where the predominance of those are being project-based. So we already have a type of working relationship. Can we expand that? Absolutely. Goals of HHH are primarily for housing for the homeless. They have the vouchers. That's key. Those who are in the public housing section that they're in already are not homeless, so they actually don't necessarily meet that definition. But
I'm talking about for the purposes of redevelopment on the properties where you have substandard housing conditions and the potential for us to utilize these resources to help meet both of the needs.
I understand that, but those who are, they're still not, they don't meet the definition of home, I hear you, I do.
So-
Yes, we have had that conversation many times, and
So-
we'll have it in the future as well. Most, if they're willing to come up and do a project that's going to be for permanent supportive housing for the homeless, then just like everybody else, we're here to talk to them and prepared. Their replacement housing for their public housing is for their existing clientele, and they don't necessarily qualify. If they're looking to expand and do, half their clientele and half permanent support housing, but currently they're really trying to just replace the housing that they have, particularly that's going on, and that doesn't necessarily meet the definitional goals of HHH at this current time. So that's the challenge in working with them, along with what other funding sources are out there to assist them.
Just wanted to add that one of the things that HACLA is looking at, and we've asked them to look at, is in terms of the redevelopment plans for Jordan Downs, what are the opportunities there and other housing developments, since they're actually increasing the unit density.
Right, and it's in relation to that, and some of, like, for example, I have San Fernando Gardens in my district. I'm interested in whatever future projects are in line that could potentially, we could help co-locate some of these types, because you have these parcels of land which in some cases could accommodate some of those needs.
Excellent. Thank you. Mr. Chairman?
My interests are more in the kind of facilities. You've got a 5% cap that you're recommending. Again, kind of as my colleague Wisar was mentioning, why are we kind of imposing these before we see how it develops organically?
Want to take that? The reason for the 5% cap is, while there were a lot of things about that first expedited RFP that aren't necessarily representative of what we expect going forward, the fact that we got so many applications totaling so much money in such a short period of time indicates that there is a lot of demand for this type of projects, or, for facilities money out there, and we thought it would be a good idea to build in a decision point at this 5% level for the first 5 issuances to make sure that we are keeping track of the balance between facilities and the purpose of, or the goal of Proposition HHH, the primary goal of Proposition HHH, to produce permanent supportive housing. We didn't want this to, just based on that very robust response the first time around, we just wanted to make sure that we have a really measured, built-in decision point on how much money we're spending on facility side.
So, Councilman, in our last report, we actually outlined and had this discussion with the COC, AOC on everyone agreeing that the priority are, supportive housing units. Now, the 5% doesn't limit us from, and again, this is 5% for the first 5 issuances, so that would count the expedited round in the next 4. But it doesn't preclude us from, say if we get amazing projects in this round, going to the AOC, COC, and then coming to you and saying, we think this cap has to be increased because we thought that the projects that came in really met our needs today, and they're worth funding. So it doesn't preclude us from recommending that. It's just, as Meg said, because I think council agreed that the priority are housing units, we just wanted to be able to come back to you whether next year or the next year and say, we think this cap should be increased and these are the reasons.
I'm concerned that the arbitrary caps, a lot of this stuff seems arbitrary, and I respect the kind of perspective view you're taking, but it seems that in itself may restrict and imply to the public that we're not. It'll be a deterrent.
And again, if we, I think on this 5% for the first 5 issuances, we could remove that for now and see what we get in this next round, which would be a more normal round. But again, as Meg said, we got $78 million in requests, and it was an expedited RFP of 2 weeks, and we were very surprised at the response. We didn't expect to get that many proposals in that short period of time, but again, we can remove it for now and then report back to you when we come back next year with recommendations.
Right. I mean, there was an
on
ask
what
for
we
70,
received.
and there's obviously a demand, but there's only $12 million that we spent.
Right. Right. And, and a lot of that was because, again, it was an expedited round, and it was clear that many of the applicants were really not ready. And a lot of the challenges were that the proposals did not meet just the eligible requirements of HHH. Many of them came without the service money, which is a challenge because, we didn't have they had no commitments from Measure H hadn't been implemented yet. So in this round, I think we'll get a lot more of those that have those service commitments.
Excellent. Thank you. Mr. Corey, Mr. Bonin. Mr. Bonin.
Thank you. First I want to follow up on some of Mr. Weezar's points. We both have very different districts, but I think we both have the same interest in seeing the distribution of housing and services around the city. And I echo his concern about the minimum size of 25. In my district, which very clearly is one of the difficult to develop areas, a term that no voter in my district would ever use to describe my district, but it's a place that's difficult to build affordable housing, and it's difficult to build permanent supportive housing. It's difficult to provide homeless services, largely because of the cost of the land. I think that one of the ways to make it easier to distribute is some of the innovative projects we've talked about. Just outside my district on the border of Culver City, we actually toured it, Mr. Harris-Dawson and I, is a former motel. It's less than 25 units. It is transitional housing, but it easily could have been permanent supportive housing, transitional housing for families, upward bound house. That could have been a great project and could be under this. I also think, given the high cost of land in my district, that incorporating some PSH into bigger projects is probably going to be a likelier way of getting stuff done in my part of town. We haven't had a ton of huge projects in my district. I mean, we've had a couple, but not the same number, certainly, that Mr. Weezar has downtown. And I'd hate to see us shut the door. So I would definitely move, unless Mr. Weezar has already made the motion, to strike the 25 minimum. And I'd concur with Mr. Cedillo on the 5% cap as well. I understand the rationale behind the 5% cap, but the period of time in which I'd be least likely to have an arbitrary cap on facilities is the early part of this program, because that's the period of time in which there's probably going to be a greater need for facilities while we're building the other stuff. So I'd similarly move that we strike that. Two more questions. One was, I was intrigued by Mr. Weezar's line of questioning about the small, difficult to develop areas. And I totally understood the point that you made about the fair housing rules and the guidelines, and we have to have a legally defensible mechanism. In my district, which is entirely in blue on that chart, and I'm very curious what that little sea of white is in the middle of CD5, because I can't imagine what that could possibly be.
I think that's great.
Yeah. And I don't mean the VA. I mean the little cloud of white next to the VA. Because I can't imagine Bel Air is an easy-to-develop area.
Maybe UCLA.
Depends what you develop.
What's that?
Maybe UCLA.
Oh, maybe UCLA. Yeah. There's a portion of my district which is even more difficult to develop, and that's in the coastal zone, where if you have a project, and I've got a couple projects proposed right now in my district in the coastal zone, you're adding probably another year and tens of thousands of dollars, because you've got to go through the dual jurisdiction and you've got to go to the Coastal Commission process. So I'm wondering whether it's now or in the second step of the process, whether there isn't a way to actually incentivize more or increase the incentive or subsidy more in the coastal zone, where you've got two layers of difficulty.
I think it's part of the secondary process of taking a look at what it is it's going to take for us to get there. This is also among 8,000 other things about location, land price, tax credit, other leverage. It's about money, and just throwing money at an issue does not resolve it. It just because I say if we put more out there, they still go build, where it might be a little bit easier. So, the answer to your question is yes. The answer is the second round when we have more data and information, because that's what we're challenged by. As we get out to that west side and other areas, neighborhood by neighborhood absolutely changes.
Yeah.
And dramatically in the land costs alone. So we need more information for the strategy, and then more information about those opportunity areas of what that assessment says, because that housing assessment is also tied to our comp plan.
Yeah.
So everybody recognizes what that's going to be for.
I just want to make sure
So
it's
about
something
how we invest our money.
that we look at. I get that throwing money at the problem doesn't necessarily solve it, but I don't want us to foreclose the option of considering that as we look at how to structure things.
We will consider it
Okay.
in the same breath that we're trying to figure out where's that threshold inside of there. I can say staff has worked. It may not feel like it here, but staff has worked very hard looking at a number of different scenarios on how to get us there. What's the cost? We've talked to people about land costs. We talked about all kinds of things. Pulled down different data sets. At the end of the day, if there's not a solid answer, and then the SDDAs gives us a current path that keeps it legally defensible, so it's not, subjective, if you will.
I totally get it.
We're working on it, I can assure you.
I raise the issue because there's only 2 of the 15 of us who represent a portion of the coastal district and are intimately familiar with the challenges the coastal district provides for something like this. And my experience over the years has been that as folks move around in different agencies, whether it's planning or housing, folks tend to forget that there's that extra barrier, and I just want to make sure we look at it. I want to ask about one more barrier. As I deal with homelessness and trying to find people housing who are homeless, you often run up against the fact that there are barriers built into the vouchers or the funding system. Either this program prohibits somebody from getting housing because they have a history of eviction, or because they have a criminal history, or because they're an undocumented immigrant. This is sort of far afield from the way you've made your recommendations, but is there a way for us to incentivize or give any preference to projects that don't have funding sources that restrict people from living there if they have any of those barriers, such as a criminal conviction, a prior eviction, or lack of proper documentation?
Just to start off that, I think one of the major barriers you're talking about has been tied to the Section 8 program, and some of the federal requirements we can't get around. So like, for instance, like convictions for producing methamphetamine. But there are other criminal background history requirements that have been imposed historically by HACLA that actually their new annual plan is removing. So the criminal background check won't disqualify people if they have, I think it's a violent conviction in the last 2 years. That's getting lifted this year. So I think that some of those are coming down by virtue of the policies that are moving forward in other places. I'm not familiar with other criminal or other kinds of exclusions on other funding sources for capital.
Well, in HACLA housing, you don't get the subsidy if you're undocumented. If half your household is documented and half isn't, you only get half the subsidy. Right. So if someone comes up with a project that doesn't have those things, is that something we can give a preference to, so we're housing folks who otherwise wouldn't get housed?
So I don't know if you could do preferences, but I think with the county resources, Measure H and Housing for Health, because it's not federal, they can get around that. I think there's an issue with preferences, but we could discuss that with the city attorney.
If you could report back on that, since I can tell it's not something anybody's really thought about. I don't want the probably not answer. I'd like us to get the actual analysis. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Excellent. Thank you. Mr. Price?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to thank staff for the extraordinary work. I know you've So you have conveyed the fact that you've been sort of pulling out your hair trying to figure out how we spread these resources around, and certainly my district would benefit from having other areas absorb some of these projects. But just a question about some of the proposed changes. We talk about potentially adding some bonus points to incent facilities in terms of citywide. What kind of points are we talking about, and who would issue them? I mean, is that part of the review process? How many would be involved? And
So we would ask for an additional narrative. If for projects that we're seeking the bonus points, we would allow an additional narrative describing the need for the services that would be provided in the facility relative to, in the area where the facility is located, relative to the availability or appropriate other services to meet that need, and ask them to, the proposers to explain how basically we're providing this service, it's not available where we're at all or near close to what the need is for the service in the area that we're going to serve.
so is it determined yet how many points that would be worth? Or
Yeah,
how
so it would be 5, I think we're looking at 5 bonus points.
Up to 5 bonus
To 5
points in that.
yes.
that-
And we're aware of a couple of data sets. We wouldn't limit it obviously to that, but we also want to make that, we also want to explain where to get that data, how to access that data as well as a part of the RFP.
And the involvement with the CES, Coordinated Entry Services, again, what are you looking for? An organization? What kinds of activities would you like to see the proposer doing in terms of involvement with CES?
So this is about, so the CES is how a lot of the countywide services for the homeless are coordinated. And this is not necessarily about making sure that the organization is directly in the CES, is trained on the assessment and all of that, but we want to make sure that there is a consideration for how they can make sure that their clients can get connected to. So if it's a transitional housing facility, how are they connecting? How can they get connected to the permanent housing that's being made available through the CES and matched to that housing from the facility that the city is funding? And the other way around, if the services are being funded or are being provided in this facility that's being funded with Proposition HHH, how can they use the CES to make that available to all of the people who have been assessed and are being case managed through the CES?
And do you expect them to have some kind of agreement with CES on that already, or just to talk philosophically about how they would like to interact?
Oh, so
should they get
providers can participate in the CES, get trained, meet the policies, all of that. So there's a very kind of more rigorous participation in the CES that would be an option. We're not requiring that, but we are saying, how are you
So again, just some discussion of what
connecting
their
with
plan
other
is.
with people who are in the CES in your area and coordinating what you're doing and making your services available, but also making sure that your clients can access those services.
Well, I think we're on the right track with this. I agree with my colleagues. I wouldn't want to put a cap. Let's see what happens. I mean, I know you were kind of overwhelmed initially with the proposals and the dollar requests, but it's an overwhelming issue. And so I think we just got to be prepared to do that. All right. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. I have a couple questions that I think, Mr. Krikorian, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I concur with my colleagues' suggestions regarding the minimum project size. It seems to me there's a great opportunity to encourage innovation, and a minimum project size may very well free some of that out. I also think I understand now the need for the incentivization in the difficult-to-develop areas, and certainly support the urgency of geographical distribution. At the same time, the countervailing point to that is by creating economic incentives for that geographical diversification, there is a cost that's paid there in terms of per unit cost efficiency. And I don't see anything, as I'm looking at the term sheet, that in any way incentivizes or prioritizes cost efficiency. And maybe I'm just not seeing it. But is there something that encourages our developers to focus a little bit more on reducing their per unit cost?
The biggest thing that does that is the cap. So the cap inside there is currently $12 million. and some would want it lifted. So if you maxed out on the cap, you could get a 120 unit project on a 9% deal and a 75 unit on a 4% deal. If you start to become more efficient, you are rewarded by that because you can actually do larger projects. And so in a non-competitive structure, we had to be a little bit more creative about how do you keep just costs from escalating just to match the amount of dollars that are out there. The other thing that we have on top of there is that the other limit on there is not to fund more than 50% of the total development cost of any specific unit. So if you find ourselves funding more than half of it, we've got ourselves kind of sideways inside the transaction. And so we also have of that limit on top of there. And so between those two, we're trying to, you want to do larger and you can be efficient, fantastic. Also recognizing some areas are more difficult than others, so you're going to need that extra room too, so you might have to, so it's a quite a balancing act, I assure you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yes, some of the recent reports were in terms of the increase in homelessness were in my district, were women victims of violence, youth, and Latinos. And in many instances, they might be the same person. We didn't fund any projects that had that characteristic to it. What are our strategies and plans for that?
For facilities, actually, we funded, most of the projects were funding various populations. We had I think we only had a veterans project in the first expedited round, but all the other facilities were funding, the variety of populations. So they were not limiting their services.
Right, but there were 5 to 6 applicants in round 1 that were focused in those areas, and they didn't get funded. That's my understanding.
Well, you mean why they weren't funded, or there were, well, let me have Meg kind of give you the rundown on some of the reasons. They were pretty much grouped into specific reasons why those other, proposals weren't funded.
I think in general, this sort of goes to what Yolanda referred to earlier. A lot of the projects that came in weren't ready. The projects that got funded had been were clearly been conceived for a longer period of time, had other funding sources, where this really was a gap and we needed them to be ready because we were issuing, this was for the issuance that was coming very few months from when we were accepting the applications. So I think that was the most common thread for a lot of the projects that didn't get funded was the readiness question. And so I think a lot of those projects, we'll have a lot longer to prepare an application this time around, and we are going to be be making those recommendations with a lot more time between when the recommendation happens and when the funding comes in.
Right. So to give you an example, to be ready, they had to be able to break ground within this fiscal year because we issued bonds in late June. And so, as you know, they have to be ready break ground within the fiscal year and expend the funds within 2 years. I think the other big issue with many of the proposals, again, was they didn't prove they had the service funding. And in fact, some of them were very honest and said, we don't have service funding. And so we, because, as you know, Prop HHH projects are required on the facility side, it's not a loan repayment like on the housing side. It's basically a service back repayment. And they have to be able to pay back through services for the life of the project. And so they really have to be able to show they have stable services because they have to be able to prove that for the life of the project. So if it's a new clinic, that could be 20, 30 years. They have to be able to do that. That's how they repay the Prop HHH money to the city through services. So that's a challenge, but we can't get around the service repayment because it's basically a tax. That's how we pay. The way we repay the bonds is a tax on all property owners in the city, and so it's really based on that, on the land. And so that was the other part of the challenge. That if they didn't have service dollars, and we didn't have the service money, only the capital dollars, and so they have to bring that as part of the proposal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. a couple questions, and I think they kind of go along with the vein of the questioning of my colleagues. I would start and preface my questions by saying that, there's a lot of appreciation for the work that you all have done on this, and there is recognition that any representation is by definition going to be a misrepresentation. So there are going to be things that you miss when you make a guess. And so I think, we accept and appreciate the amount of rigor that you all have put into coming up with the various guesses. But the one I get most concerned about is the cap at the top. So at $12 million, and, without being a developer or a real estate expert, there are projects funded in my district right now that you couldn't do for $15 million in even Venice, much less Brentwood or Sherman Oaks. And so it just it strikes me, it's troubling to me that if somebody said, oh, I have this opportunity to buy this piece of land at the market value, and I'm going to forego the profit I could make off that land, and I'm going to build permanent supportive housing. And the city has this bond, and I'm going to try to access that bond. And I see the $12 million limit, and that's kind of curtains for me in that particular deal, unless I do something really, really small, which then I might come up against the 25-unit cap. So can you talk to us some about the thinking around the limit at the top end? Because, otherwise just the economy of scale will put you every time outside of the blue area. And it seems to me that even the additional incentives that you put there don't make up for the unevenness in land costs.
Yeah, land costs will vary from area to area, so until we do some land use controls to help control land costs, that will always be an issue. I would say with the cap is part of the cost control, as I mentioned to Councilmember Krikorian, that the program is quite generous in how it's structured. And so one of the keys to keep from over-subsidizing a project is the total loan cap. So how you fund the projects, the units underneath, is the mix of how you put your project together, and it's giving you the maximum subsidy across the spectrum. So in some cases, if you're more efficient, then that number is going to be more than enough. If you're less efficient, it's going to be more of a problem for you. In most cases that we've seen, some have hit the cap, but they have bigger issues than that, quite honestly. But it's also in there because we are encouraging leveraging. In order to hit our goal, we must encourage leveraging. And so if you're telling me $12 million is not enough, I hear you, then you're going to hit what we're going to say is, okay, is that 50% of the project? Because now you're going to, if it's 25, then you still need another 13 million more. You still have to go for tax credits or something else along the way. So part of that was to make sure we keep efficient, to make sure they leverage. It'll take you up to 120 units on a 9% deal, which is a very large deal. And once you get to 120, you're going to go to something else. You're going to break it into two. It'll take you to 75 units on a 4% transaction, just with the base. The base is $140,000 a door for 4%, $100,000 for a 9% transaction. That's quite a generous number. It's actually more generous than most of the other funding programs that we have out there. If you were to look at the Veterans Program, last time, this 2016 cap was $10 million, and they only fund the very specific unit, and it starts at somewhere around $46,000 and stops depending, and it goes up based on the unit size. So we're funding a little bit more appropriately for the challenges of LA. We're helping fund some of the non-permanent supportive housing units because there's no other funding out there. And overall, we're trying to make sure that you're leveraging, that you're not abusing the system and how it works, and that all of that comes together to give us the housing we need. So it is that balancing act inside of there. We review our regulations every single year. I can tell you, right now, if we put $7 million into one housing transaction, when you see that, we put a lot of money. We get about $21 million available each year for home. So if we over-subsidize, we don't build the units that we need to do. And there's other sources, and there will be other sources. And as we look at each year and we do each reg, we will adjust according to what's going on inside the market and what we find. So you will find us at the beginning of next year going through the assessment of all the tax credit rounds that just passed this year and where costs are going and making an adjustment to the program. At this particular moment in time, 12 million, there's some on the outlier that are challenging, but those aren't their real challenges. We've seen some very large projects proposed, and we talk about, hey, when they're that large, you break them into two. Got a glimpse of the funding the other day. They actually broke it into two, so that's not 12 million, that's $24 million. So now it's $24 million into one project. So there's ways to deal with that, but still maintain your costs and your efficiencies as appropriate.
I think the other thing I would add is that every public and private source has a cap, and everybody does it for the same reasons, right? You don't want to over-subsidize a project, and what will happen if you increase the cap is that that developer will now go get the county money. So if they don't have to get the other subsidies, they won't, right? And so that means the city will pay for more of the unit. And so you have to remember, the higher our subsidy, the higher the cap, the fewer units we will finance. And so the reason why all of the, again, public and private sources have a cap is because they expect the developers to leverage. So that's the one point I would make, that it's important to understand that. And then on the acquisition side, the city has, in partnership with the supportive housing, the Corporation for Supportive Housing, an acquisition loan fund. So that actually is the fund that helps developers acquire the land before they even come to get Prop HHH money. So we just have to keep that in mind, that there's this acquisition money through this loan fund that first helps them buy the land. Then they come forward to HCID to get the early commitment for Prop HHH financings. Then they go get their entitlements, get all the leveraging sources, then they come back to HCID when they're ready. So, and with what HCID is proposing, at least for this next fiscal year, with the increase in the developer fee, that will increase their subsidy from tax credits, so that it will allow them to have the projects pencil out in Mr. Bonin's district, in Mr. Akorian's district, and still make a very decent developer fee. Because that's the only way developers are going to do this, if it pencils out.
So, and on this last round, you all said most were in the range that were inside your, they were above the 25 units and they were around $7 million, I think was the number that you gave, was the request. Were there any that were at the edges, up on the top end?
Yeah, there were some that...
And were they in the blue areas?
I apologize because I don't remember if they were actually in the blue areas. One of them might have been. Some were at the, and I'm presuming ones that you're asking that didn't get funded.
Right.
Of the ones that didn't get funded, yes, they were up there. And so, like, some needed 12 non-blue area, $12 million, plus they needed like another $7 or $10 million in home to happen. And you have to take a look at a project. And I apologize because we had so many funding sources.
Right.
It's going as a 4% transaction. I'm going to tell you right now, when you have that kind of financing, that you need to be going as a 9% tax credit financing so that you can get the additional credits, the equity, and the funding necessary to actually make that deal happen the appropriate way. So sending it down the appropriate financing path is also a key here. Just so we can increase the cap, but they still need to move over to the appropriate financing structure for what they're building.
So to those projects, we said no?
We said no because their request was way out in the financing realm. So for HHH at this time, do I expect them to restructure their deal and come back? Absolutely. And they'll come back as most likely a 9% transaction, and you will see it.
So, and just to point out, in the round that was funded, that you approved on June 7th,
yes.
Those projects, HCID really was able to expedite most of those because of Prop HHH. But most of them, except for one, was using 4% tax credits, which basically means that the city subsidizes more of the unit, right? Because 4% provides less of a subsidy than 9%. But they were able to expedite so that really they were helping to finance these projects about 2 years earlier than they could have if we didn't have HHH. So I think a lot of the subsidies probably, and that's the reason for the increased subsidy, right? So what you'll see hopefully in the future is more projects with 9%, and the city subsidy will be lower as HSID builds up their pipeline for Prop HHH.
And what would you say is the stability of this tax credit program?
Well, everybody's very worried about it, but things don't seem to be moving very quickly in Washington. And so we hope that will remain the issue, because tax reform is a real concern for low-income housing tax credits.
Okay. Thank you all so much. This has been a really rich discussion. You have taken a lot of questions from a lot of concerned members. It seems like we have a few things on the queue that we need to deal with before we move this. And I say that not putting forward a motion, but being concerned about the top end of the cap creating a chilling effect and chilling our ability to disperse projects throughout the city. But there was one issue raised around the projects smaller than 25 units. Mm-hmm. There was another one about capitalizing on land that's already in public hands, namely HACLA. And if a project, as I understood it, Councilwoman Rodriguez, if a project could be made more dense and the new units could they qualify for HHH? And then the cap on facilities,
the 5%.
Revisiting the cap on facilities. And if there is a way that doesn't hold up our project, doesn't hold up this cycle, I would like us to take a hard look at the top end cap as well.
Okay, so our understanding is that you'd like us to remove the 25% minimum from the term sheet for HSID and the 25 unit cap and the 5% limit on the first 5 issuance on facilities, which we will. And could you give us HSID the year to study the cap? Are you willing to leave it for these term sheet? The 12 million per project cap?
So I think it's fine to leave the cap, but what I'd like us to do is have an envelope that you keep all these proposals in that come up against the caps that we've set, because it just feels like we will lose opportunities. I mean, you already lose opportunities because someone might look at it and say, I'm not even trying, but then there's another set of people that will walk right up to the edge, right? And I say that having been one that's applied for a lot of grants during my life. So if there can be an envelope where we keep track of those and we kind of assess what kind of barrier it is or is not. And then we still have the issue of the publicly owned land with HACLA.
Yes. So we can have a conversation with HACLA on their upcoming projects and see what their plans are for supportive housing and report back.
Okay.
Great.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair, I had that report back I wanted as well.
Okay.
I'll state it more succinctly for Mr. Villanueva, if nobody else. Request that CAO, CLA, City Attorney, HSID, and other departments as relevant or necessary report back on whether or not the city can incentivize or provide bonus points for Triple H funding for projects that do not rely on other funding sources that pose barriers to housing based on immigration status, criminal history, eviction history, and other concerns.
Mr. Chair, but to be clear, you eliminated the 25 minimum size?
Yes.
Direction of that?
Yes. Yes. Clerk, you want to review what we have before us?
Yes, sir. For item number 1, you're approving the report as amended, removing the minimum project size for the term sheet, threshold requirement as detailed in attachment 1, and removing the cap on the total funds available for non-city facilities as part of the Proposition HHA's Facilities Program, and amendment by Councilmember Bonin to report back on the removing the barriers to access the subsidized housing.
And also report back on
HACLA
HACLA opportunities.
On the HACLA opportunities.
And
I had them all.
keep track of the rejected projects.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Report back on, especially with that requested more than the cap on the 12. Okay.
Excellent. So moved. Is there a second? Second. Hearing no objection, that'll be the order.
Okay, sir. Item number 2.
Number 2, ladies and gentlemen, we are at 4:30. Many members have to be somewhere very soon. Let's roll as quickly as we can.
Okay.
Mr. Clerk.
Item number 2 is Bureau of Contract Administration, CAO, and CLA to report relative to motion Cedillo, Englander, Harris, Lawson, Krikorian, Rue, Weston, Wisar, related to an ordinance that would implement a citywide project labor agreement for projects funded with Proposition HHH bond proceeds, including provisions for local hire employing transitional disadvantaged workers who are residents of the city, similar to the Board of Public Works Public Infrastructure Stabilization Ordinance, and other agreements at the Port of Los Angeles World Airports, and relevant city departments. This item is scheduled pursuant to Council action of June 9, 2017. And we have cards on this item, sir.
Excellent. If you could get the cards. If you have a card here, you should just come on up. Mr. Ron Miller, Mr. Antonio Sanchez, Ted of the AFL-CIO, Mr. Tim Norris, Dave Kirsch.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Miller, yes, sir.
I'm Ron Miller, Executive Secretary of the LA Orange County Building Trades. I won't take up a lot of your time. I laid out the building trades plan the last time I was here, and I took the advice of the board here, and we have had several meetings with SCAMP, with Mr. Alan Greenlee, to come talk about what a project labor agreement should look like and try to get to a point to where we both agree. We've had some fruitful talks, and we relayed that information to Mr. Riemer, who's working on a report that you guys tasked him to put together. And from what I've seen of the report, I think the building trades can live with the report that he's put out. So I'll be short and brief, and we'd like to see this move along also.
Thank you. Mr. Sanchez.
Quickly, IBEW Local 11. As we talk about local hire and how we've exceeded those goals, targeted hire very important, specifically veterans. So we know that a large population of our homeless, a large percentage are unfortunately veterans. So we in the building trade, specifically IBEW, is working very hard to bring in more veterans. So we've reserved at least 50% of our apprenticeship seats for veterans. So this is helping in many ways, just in full support of the PLA. Thank you.
Thank you. Sir.
My name is Ted Chandler. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the AFL-CIO Housing Investment Trust. We're a fund that invests union capital in building affordable housing. And I wanted to share with you a bit of data that we have. The median annual wage for a construction worker in LA is about $30,000 a year. That qualifies them for affordable housing. And as you know, when someone gets into an apprenticeship, soon they can expect to earn enough so that they no longer qualify for that affordable housing. So I urge you to keep exemptions as small as possible and a unit threshold that will result in at least a majority of developments funded by Triple H as being under the application of the project labor agreement. That brings the benefit of our financing when labor's capital is brought in. It reduces the public subsidy that's necessary. That stretches Triple H dollars. It means that more affordable and permanent supportive housing can be built. And
thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Tim Norris. I'm with Walton Construction Services. We're a general contractor that's been in business for about 70 years. We're a family-owned business. We're coming up on our 4th generation. And the only work we do is supportive housing, affordable housing, veterans housing. That's all we do. And we've been working with some of these developers for generations. And the project labor agreement, if applied to some of the projects we're working on, would make it difficult for some of our smaller trades. We would lose out on a lot of our sub-pool for some of the smaller trades, and it would make it difficult for us to stay in this market, and we may consider moving to a different market, which would be difficult for some of the developers we work with. All of our projects are prevailing wage. Many of our trades, most of them are union now, but forcing the PLA would make it very difficult if it's forced on the smaller trades for our projects.
Thank you. Mr. Kirsch?
David Kirsch. I'm the executive director of the Carpenters.
Hold on. Mr. Kirsch.
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is David Kirsch. I'm the executive director of the Carpenters Contractors Cooperation Committee, which is the labor management group of the Carpenters Union and the contractors. We're here to show our strong support for the project labor agreement, and we're proud to be able to be partners and be able to build these facilities. This is a way in which we're going to be able to create good-paying jobs with apprenticeship and with other opportunities. You know, we just had a situation this week where the labor commissioner filed a lawsuit for $6 million on behalf of 250 workers who are victims of wage theft. And so we think this is the way in which we make sure that we have jobs with dignity, where workers are treated fair, and we give back to the community. So again, we're very supportive of this issue. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Mr. Alvidrez, Mr. Anderson, Mr. Greenlee, Mr. Alvidrez, Ms. Anderson, Mr. Jerry Jones.
Good afternoon. Mike Alvidrez, Skidder Housing Trust. I guess I'm a member of the community that is supposed to deliver the goods with supportive housing consistent with what the voters intended, 10,000 units in the next 10 years. We are in a period of time where there is a lot of volatility in our field. Number one, the tax credit program, as you heard from staff, is in flux. We don't know where we're going to land. What we're all, I think, nervous about is to deliver a good product on time and on budget. And some of the issues that exist today in our environment make us very nervous about achieving that. Secondarily, aside from the tax credit program, we don't know what HUD is going to do with respect to some of the federal programs that we rely on. Again, that could compromise some of our development budgets. And third, we're seeing, because of the hot construction market that we're in today, prices are going up. Given that, and I think given our support for a PLA, I would suggest that we keep the cap at 75 units threshold on a go-forward basis and a very short look-back period so we can assess the program as we go forward. Thank you.
Appreciate you. Ms. Anderson?
Amy Anderson from Path Ventures. We are in strong support of paying good wages. We pay prevailing wages on all of our developments. We're concerned about the impact a PLA could have on the cost of our projects because of the hot market that Mike was referring to. Subs have a lot of choice right now in terms of which projects they're working on. And they are going to choose a project that doesn't involve signing on to a PLA if they have that choice, or they're going to offer us a bid that is astronomically expensive. So we want to make sure that we can deliver the units that we committed to deliver to the voters and to the council. So we've been working really closely with the trades to try and find terms that are amenable. As Mike mentioned, 75 units, allowing for some kind of safety valve, which allows for bids from subs that aren't signed on to the PLA. Those are two critical terms. Thank you.
Mr. Jones.
Jerry Jones, Intercity Law Center. I help coordinate the Provider Alliance to End Homelessness. It's 57 organizations working in coalition. On July 20th, the Alliance sent a letter to Council President Wesson, which each of your offices also received, strongly supporting project labor agreements, but at a 75-unit threshold. So we'd ask that in your guidance to the city attorney in crafting this PLA ordinance that there be some way for providers who are having trouble getting a sufficient number of qualified bids to have some other options if those bids don't materialize. And then finally, in this July 20th letter, we emphasize the importance of HHH working for both small agencies as well as large, producing big projects and small projects. So we were very heartened to hear the conversation just happened about caps. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Greenlee.
Good afternoon, council members. First of all, let me express my appreciation for the great and deliberate work that you guys are doing thinking through this issue. I want to express my appreciation to Mr. Riemer for his thoughtful and insightful work, and express my appreciation to Mr. Miller for being willing to meet with me over and over and over again. I won't reiterate some of the things that folks have said already, but fundamentally, the notion of applying a project labor agreement changes the fundamental nature of how we've done our work for over 2 generations, and it will have impact on the number of units that get developed. And as you know, clearly know, the voters said we want to triple the amount of permanent supportive housing that gets done. And so we want to be very careful, very deliberate about how we do this. And so the one point I'll make that doesn't reiterate other ones is maybe we can look at some structure that looks back at the performance over the last year or two so that we can amend and shift the project labor agreement to make sure that we're meeting the voter goals. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. So we have representatives from the CAO and CLA's office and the leadership of our Bureau of Contract Administration. If you could join us. Greenlee.
Good afternoon, Council. John Riemer, Director of the Bureau of Contract Administration.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, as you've already alluded to the fact that time is short,
yes,
we provided you a letter giving you some conditions for consideration. I appreciate the opportunity to be involved in this process, and along with the CAO and the CLA and the council offices, HCID, we've had some very good, meaningful conversation. I want to thank and acknowledge Alan Greenleaf, SCAMP, and their representatives. They've conducted themselves very professionally. They've given ear, and I say the same thing for the building trades and Ron Miller. I've seen movement on both sides, and our report to you attempts to address that. There are many things that, as we presented to you last time, one can find in a project labor agreement, but taking the cue from council with respect to a desire to not only provide permanent supported housing for those that don't have it, but also career paths for those individuals that will need the housing, as it was already alluded to, many of those individuals that are homeless or veterans. The project labor agreement was presented as a tool that you would like to consider as used to conquer both challenges before us. We did note the fact that, as your ordinance, your motion wanted us to consider the Public Works PLA, the Ports PLA, the airports, that there were some distinct differences between what we have at Public Works and this environment that we're in. So we also examined the old CRA PLA, which we spoke to in our letter to you. The main issue, quite frankly, is threshold as it relates to when the agreement will apply, not if it will apply. There are some concerns over small businesses, and we attempted to address that, which I will walk you through. With respect to threshold, HCID provided us a package of projects that had already been awarded, roughly 85. We took a look to see, given the size and nature of those projects, where would 75 or a number that had been used, where would that shake out with respect to opportunities for what your motion wanted, which was projects under a PLA. And the 75 number was much lower than 50% of the projects. It was in the neighborhood of roughly 43%. So the concern was, if we want to provide career opportunities for individuals, what would be a good number? Again, I would argue that both the building trades, they came up from their number, and to SCAM's credit, they came down. When we met as a collective group, because you asked us to do that also, both with the CAO and the working team and the representatives came in, conversations took the threshold up to 125 at one point, based on a concern that the permanent supportive housing, which much smaller in size than the units that were alluded to in the CRA PLA. With that said, conversation continued, and I do want to publicly thank and acknowledge Alan and Ron for their diligent discussions that have not stopped, by the way. Our discussions here today are to keep this moving, but they are continuing to discuss this, and they've pledged to me that they want to meet a number. In the document that I've given you, on the last 2 pages, it speaks to considerations for you. SCAMP provided a letter. In the letter, the initial number was 75 for threshold units. It went up to 125. You've heard a request today to bring it to 75. Our consideration is 65 based on the information that we received from HCID. 65 would roughly cover, based on what had happened in the past, not knowing what's going to happen in the future, it would cover roughly 56% of those projects.
And let me just stop you on this math. So we just, before you got up here, removed the lower level cap at 25. Mm-hmm. So the math on that is that would decrease the amount that will be covered under the suggested number? Well, because I assume that your number says, assume that there would be no 25 or less.
Well, the numbers that we use went as low as 17 units, I would argue. Okay. So it still would take that in consideration. And I'm not in a position to know what the market's going to do with respect to how projects will come in. I want to believe, and I told staff I was going to try very hard not to say what I want to believe, that there is an appreciation for what's trying to happen here, providing career path opportunities as well as housing opportunities. So the 65 is a number that attempts to capture that, leaving enough projects not under PLA and projects under PLA. That, one could argue, represents both camps. The concern over impact on small contractors speaks to us as an issue of education. And the word wasn't used, but I'll use it, a fear of the unknown. Prevailing wages are being paid. That's not in dispute. Apprenticeship requirements must take place. That's not in dispute. So the notion over what would cause the cost to rise, we did not reach that. We didn't find that. Conversation can continue, but if the prevailing wage is something that's going to be paid anyway, and apprentices have to be used anyway, I don't know where the cost could potentially go up other than a concern over the interaction with the building trades. That's the education piece. That's, let's do this and see what we can accomplish. When we did have the CRA PLA, we did list in the report to you 3 of the projects that we did begin monitoring. All 3 of them were well over 30% with respect to local hire. This is not something that we have not done before. Does it take hand-holding? Yes, it does. Does it take listening? Yes, it does. Does it take an appreciation for the challenges on both sides? Most certainly it does. Can this be successful? We've already demonstrated that it is. So the notion of coming with a number that would exempt certain contractors, we find that problematic in the sense that you potentially could have a project where some contractors on a project would be under a PLA and some contractors on a project would not be on a PLA. Administratively, it would be harsh. I won't even speak to morale-wise with respect to some workers under an agreement, other workers not under an agreement. So we don't have that as a model that we could give you a success story to. The PLA that the Public Works has no subcontractor exemptions. We did provide you some projects that showed a number of subcontractors that worked under PLAs that were under the $200,000 number that was given in the letter from SCAMF. As a matter of fact, we took a look at a project that we did not include in the list. It's a fire station that we did in the city. It's a $12 million project. On that project, they had 18 subcontractors that worked on subcontracts less than $200,000. And they all worked under a project labor agreement, and the local hire percentage on that project was 34%. So it is something that can happen. I'm still at a loss as to how the costs would increase. I don't know what that might be. I'm open to further dialogue, and at the conclusion of this, I would recommend we do go forward and the conversations continue, because as I understand, the purpose today is for you to just give the city attorney direction to come back to you with an agreement. We can start writing that, drafting that, while we're continuing to have the discussions, and I can hear more information that could speak to what potentially would cause the price to increase. There was a concern over grievances. The project labor agreements, every single one of them, that Public Works does have a specified grievance procedure. Term was an issue that came up with respect to, let's take it slowly. We have a 5-year term in Public Works. The CRA had a 3-year term with 2 one-year renewals for a total of 5 years. So that's an option that you may want to consider with respect to being able to monitor. But we can always, as we do now, report to you on a regular basis with respect to the success of these projects. Right now, we report to the Board of Public Works on a quarterly basis as it relates to all of our project labor agreements. So if there is an issue or a concern, we certainly can bring it to your attention. It can already be calendared for us to come before this committee and let you know how things are going, because I can appreciate the unknown being a concern that by nature would cause prices to quite possibly go up. There was a concern over core workforce. In the letter presented, there was a desire to identify a core worker as someone who has already been working for a period of 30 out of 60 days. The Public Works PLA and most of the PLAs in the region have a period of 60 of 100 days. So what you have with respect to considerations, we feel are solid directions to us to give us an idea how to go forward. It would give us latitude with respect to how far we can and cannot go to bring back before you a draft PLA that has been discussed with both parties.
Excellent, thank you. If there is not anything else pertinent, Ms. Chavez?
So just very briefly, on the facility side, we had a little bit more of a challenge because, as you know, we don't have the type of data that HCID has on the projects, but just based on conversations with John, and I just want to thank him because he was very gracious with his time in meeting with our stakeholders and hearing their input. We discussed proposing at least to start off with a total development cost of $5 million for facilities, a little different, of course, because we don't have units and not a lot of data, and maybe test that for 2 years and then come back to you with the report back, or I'm sure John will be reporting on a regular basis. So that was a proposal on the facility side.
Excellent. Members' inquiries. Mr. Bonin.
Thanks. A few questions. Obviously very strongly in support of this, and I want to thank you for your work on it. I just have a couple questions, because this gets very technical very quickly, and it can get confusing. So particularly when you talk about numbers. So John, I appreciate the analysis of the projects and what would get to sort of 50%, which seems like a real sweet spot. That's 50% of the projects. Do we also know, I don't know what the right metric is. Is it projects? Is it units? Is it dollars? Have we also looked at what the balance would be if we looked at it from number of units and dollars?
There was a concern over dollars, given the nature of the economy right now. Prices are going up simply because it's a contractor's market.
Sure.
They're able to demand their price, and so using the dollars was a concern. I mean, we did look at that. I mean, if we solely looked at that, all of the projects would qualify under a PLA based on public works standards.
Right.
And we recognize that's just not appropriate now, that we're walking into new territory. We certainly want to respect both sides. So the 65 number is solely based on units. And we took a look at...
Oh, no, I understand what you're answering. I'm asking a slightly different question. The question of the threshold has been the number of units.
Yes.
And you determined that 65 as a threshold would mean about 50% of the projects are covered.
It's in the neighborhood of 56%. So
Right.
based on the information we received from HCID, historically over the past, from 2013 up until now, there were 85 projects. We looked at all these projects with respect to the number of units that each one had, low as 17, as high as 100 and something. And based on that, we saw that roughly 65 would give you roughly 50%, 56%.
Got it. So if you use 65 as the threshold, do we know what percentage of the projects that would include? Or no, what percentage of the units built that would include? Not projects. I'm just trying to see how it matches up if you look at it through different prisms.
Yeah, we could give you that. I get the question you're asking. I think it's... I can get you the answer.
Okay.
I'll get you the answer.
And the other question I'd like to know, it's along the same lines, is if 65 is the threshold, what percentage of the dollars spent would be on PLA projects versus non-PLA projects?
Yeah, that would be, well, the raw dollars spent, we could get you that.
Okay.
But I don't know if it would give you a true indicator of what we're up against, because this is going to include acquisition and rehabilitation. It's going to include new construction, demolition. I mean, there's several categories, so the monies would not necessarily be seen as the same, even though it's money.
I just want to be able to see it from all sides, because the numbers you gave us in terms of the negotiations, you can look at them two ways. You can say the trades went from 40 to 65 units and say that means they only went up 25 units and SCAMP went down 60 units. Or you can look at it differently, and you can say the building trades went up, they went up, they gave 62% leeway, and SCAMP only gave 48% leeway in terms of the numbers that changed. So it's just, you can look at the numbers either way and get different analysis. So when I came in, I was inclined more towards 75. Your analysis makes me more comfortable with 65 because it gets us to that sweet spot. But I'm curious to see if you look at it in the other ways. It could be that we're spending more dollars not on PLA projects, or we're building more units not through project labor agreements, and it might actually be the wrong deal for the folks who want the PLAs. I'm just curious, all three ways.
Yeah, just based on looking back, the numbers strongly suggest that the higher we go from 65, the fewer opportunities you'll have for job opportunities.
Sure.
Because you won't have projects under a PLA.
Right.
And I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. My other question was, and this is not my field, so I want to be clear on this, is the metric that your report seems to like using for figuring out the PLA threshold is the TDC, the total development cost?
We used it for a discussion point, but not as a focal point.
So, because here's what I'm getting at. I'm just trying to figure out how much that metric is going to be used going forward.
Got it.
Is if we use TDC as the threshold measurement for projects, the city's going to need to analyze pro formas. And my experience with how we look at SB 1818 projects is that we don't do a very good job looking at pro formas. And if we're setting ourselves up to be looking at pro formas, we need different staffing, different resources, and that's something we need to consider, because we just don't have that expertise, that staffing, that skill level to know if we're looking at an accurate or a serious pro forma.
We worked real hard to try to find something that was a widget. That no matter what, a widget, no matter what happened, it would be the same. Square footage is something we would have loved to focus on.
Yeah.
Simply due to the fact that the CRA PLA, one argued, was not solely based on permanent supportive housing. The unit's going to be much larger, and that was the initial thought that the SCAMP reps brought to us with respect to wanting to increase it to 125, because those are larger. Now you're coming down to smaller.
Right.
But it's a widget. It's measurable. So the unit is measurable. The dollar cost, however, the variable is in play.
Right. The unit is measurable. I just don't know that we have the tape measure to measure it.
No, I understand.
Or the knowing how to read a tape measure.
No, I understand.
The other thing is the project cost could go up significantly. So how often do we update and stuff like that? So I'd like us to think about what the right potential other measures or metrics would be.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bonham. Mr. Clerk, so I think we have instructions. If you could read those into the record.
For item number 2, sir, is it the intention of the committee to note and file the report?
Yes.
And to request the city attorney with the assistance of Bureau of Contract Administration to prepare and present a draft ordinance to provide that Proposition HHH funded projects include the project labor agreements subject to the following parameters. A PLA will be required if the following thresholds are met. All housing developments of 65 units or more, any facility development of 5 million or more, and any mixed-use development that includes both permanent supportive housing and facilities, provided that the PLA already applies to the housing development. BCA will provide educational outreach and training to ensure that developers understand the requirements of a PLA, including requirements aimed at advancing job opportunities for underrepresented communities. The PLA will require that core work staff be included on the active payroll at least 60 days out of the 100 days preceding the award of the contract. The PLA specifies the minimum number of bids needed from subcontractors per each crop of work. The PLA includes a grievance procedure that is fair and unbiased to deal with potential jurisdiction disputes, work stoppages, to deal with potential or interpretation of PLA policy or other project-related issues, and the length of time in which the PLA ordinance will be in effect for a term of 3 years with 2 separate 1-year renewals, and a hybrid tiered approach for hiring by contractors, including 3 tiers for project wages and zip codes based on socioeconomic factors.
Excellent, thank you. So if there's no objection, that'll be the instruction.
There you go.
Excellent, thank you so much.
Yes, sir. And
we have Ms. Nbella and Mr. Grody, general public comment. Going once. All right, let's do it. If we can keep the room quiet, we have 2 people who have signed up and waited to speak. Ms. Nbella.
I want to apologize because I sent in a complaint. I thought you forgot about me.
All right, see?
When you receive it, dismiss it.
You can count on me.
Hi, my name is Luis Mbala, and today I'm advocating on the behalf of No Place to Go scheduled toilet report. And so we spend months and months and months, over 20 people of us in the community, to do this toilet assessment. And we're asking for about 100 public and safe toilets. You know, we'd like the resources to come by the end of December 2017. Basically, what's going on is we want to address the lack of public toilet that was in the public health and mental health crisis on Skid Row. And thank you for addressing the housing crisis. But in the meantime, people have to use the bathrooms. And so we'd like to be an item agenda on the next homeless committee.
Thank you.
All right.
Got you.
Okay.
Can I give
yes,
you?
sir. Yes, my name's Tom Grody. I'm a Skid Row resident, so I'm just echoing what she said about us being an agenda item on the next Homelessness Poverty Committee. But I just want to call your attention, if you didn't see this, this is an editorial from LA Times, July 13th, in reading this toilet audit that came out. And the key statistic is on Skid Row right now, the availability of toilets is only between 10 and 20% of what exists as a minimum standard for a UN refugee camp. Wow. So it's an extremely strong editorial, and the basic point is that without more access to public toilets, the streets of Skid Row literally have become a public toilet. So it's a health crisis. It's been neglected for many years, but there's a coalition of people in Skid Row that have come together and are really focused on this.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're adjourned.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.